It happened in the dead of night. At 03:17 a.m., radar operators in Eastern Europe saw something they hoped they would never see. A swarm of unidentified objects streaking across the skies at hypersonic speeds. Within minutes, air raid sirens blared, lights across entire cities went dark, and the first explosions ripped through military installations near the border. This was no drill. This was the first strike. A lightning attack designed to cripple defenses before anyone could respond. Fighter jets scrambled, anti-air batteries roared to life, but it was already too late. A command center lay in flames, fuel depots erupted like volcanoes, and shaken soldiers ran for cover. The world had just witnessed the opening shots of a conflict that could engulf all of humanity. But before we go deeper into this story, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this video from? Our audience comes from every corner of the world, and I'd love to see your country in the comments. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe. We bring you daily breakdowns of global military events, and this one might be the most dangerous yet. The attack began with silence. No warning, no diplomatic signals, no media leaks. Just silence, until it broke with a deafening roar. At exactly 03:17 a.m., satellites registered the ignition of ballistic launchers hundreds of miles away. Within seconds, hypersonic projectiles were airborne. Their targets: NATO radar outposts, air defense systems, and forward bases along the frontier. Commanders had always theorized about such a moment, but when it came, they were caught flat-footed. In underground bunkers, officers shouted conflicting orders as screens lit up red. Defensive systems had only minutes to react. One of the first targets was a sprawling airbase, home to dozens of advanced aircraft. Pilots, jolted from their sleep, sprinted across the tarmac, helmets in hand, while ground crews scrambled to roll jets into hardened shelters. But the missiles were faster. A fuel depot detonated with such force that the shockwave shattered windows 20 kilometers away. By dawn, images of burning runways and destroyed hangars flooded global news channels. Panic spread far beyond the battlefield. Civilians jammed highways, desperate to escape what they feared was the beginning of World War III. Meanwhile, in Washington, Brussels, and London, phones rang nonstop. Intelligence chiefs delivered the same message. The first strike had landed, and the world would never be the same again. The first strike left the world reeling. Within minutes of the explosions, live feeds showed burning bases, twisted aircraft wreckage, and terrified civilians rushing underground. But the shockwaves were not just physical. They were political, diplomatic, and psychological. In Washington, D.C., the Situation Room filled in less than 15 minutes. The president, flanked by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and senior generals, received the bluntest possible briefing. NATO territory had been hit directly. This was not a border skirmish. This was an attack on the alliance itself. Across the Atlantic, NATO headquarters in Brussels went on high alert. Military planners triggered Article 4 consultations, while debates raged. Was this the moment to invoke Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, and treat the strike as an attack on every member? The words were clear. The consequences were unthinkable. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away, the U.S. Navy's Sixth Fleet was already on the move. In the Mediterranean, carrier strike groups prepared to launch combat air patrols. Submarines slipped beneath the waves, cutting all communications as they moved into attack positions. Satellites shifted their orbits, focusing sensors on suspected launch sites. But the response wasn't only military. World leaders scrambled for answers. Emergency calls lit up secure lines between Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris. In Moscow, the Kremlin issued its own statement, blaming NATO for provocations and insisting that the strike was a defensive measure. Few believed it. Many feared what would come next. Across global markets, the effect was immediate. Oil prices surged. Stock exchanges plunged. Civil aviation was paralyzed as entire swaths of airspace were declared no-fly zones. Millions of ordinary people woke up to a nightmare they had only seen in movies: war between nuclear powers. Inside NATO's frontline countries, the reaction was far more visceral. In Poland, Latvia, and Romania, air raid sirens wailed for hours. Civilians crowded into subway stations, makeshift bunkers, and school basements. Parents clutched their children, listening to distant explosions and praying the next missile would not land on their city. The military, however, had no time for fear. Across the alliance, squadrons of F-35s and Eurofighter Typhoons roared into the sky. Patriot PC-3 missile batteries activated across Eastern Europe, scanning for follow-up waves of hypersonics. NATO cyber units moved into overdrive, attempting to blind the enemy's radar and disrupt command networks. And in the halls of government, the biggest question was asked aloud: should we strike back immediately? The hawks argued yes, delay meant weakness, and weakness meant more attacks. The doves urged caution. A direct counterstrike could ignite a full-scale war no one could control. What do you think? Should NATO have launched an immediate retaliation? Or would that risk plunging the world into an irreversible global war? Tell me in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective. Back in Washington, the president gave the order for DEFCON 3, the highest alert level since the Gulf War. Bomber squadrons at Barksdale and Minot Air Force Base fueled up their B-52 Stratofortresses, while the cutting-edge B-21 Raider stealth bombers quietly prepared for deployment. In the North Atlantic, ballistic missile submarines began moving into new patrol boxes, their locations known only to a handful of admirals. Every nation knew the truth. The opening strike was only the beginning. The real test was about to come. And how the alliance responded now would decide whether the conflict could be contained, or whether it would erupt into World War III. The initial strikes had thrown Europe into chaos, but within hours it became clear that this was not just a regional war. It was spreading, like fire racing across dry grass. As NATO scrambled jets and raised its defenses, another storm was gathering thousands of miles away. In the early hours of the crisis, Chinese warships moved aggressively into contested waters near Taiwan. Satellite images confirmed the presence of multiple Type 055 destroyers and at least one aircraft carrier, their decks bristling with fighter jets. Beijing issued a chilling statement. Any interference in Asia will be met with decisive force. To many observers, it sounded less like a warning and more like a declaration. Taiwan's radars soon lit up with contacts, dozens of aircraft crossing the median line of the Taiwan Strait. The island's F-16V fighters scrambled, bracing for dogfights that could decide the fate of Asia. At the same time, the U.S. 7th Fleet surged forward. The carrier USS Ronald Reagan launched combat patrols, while submarines prowled the depths, ready to strike if war broke out in the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Iran sensed opportunity. Within hours of the European strike, Tehran announced it had deployed hypersonic ballistic missiles to forward bases. Their stated purpose: deterrence. But the message was unmistakable. Israel and U.S. forces were now within reach of Iranian firepower. Tensions soared when an Israeli surveillance drone was shot down near the Persian Gulf. The Israeli Air Force placed its F-35I Adirs on high alert, while American bases in Qatar and Bahrain reinforced air defenses. The region was a powder keg, and everyone knew it. And then came North Korea. As the world focused on Europe and the Middle East, Pyongyang staged its own show of power. Multiple short-range ballistic missiles were launched into the Sea of Japan, splashing down dangerously close to shipping lanes. Kim Jong-un appeared on state television, declaring that his forces were ready to strike at imperialist aggressors wherever they stand. South Korea mobilized reserves, and U.S. bases in the Pacific prepared for the worst. The escalation was not just military, it was psychological. News networks broadcast images of burning bases, dogfights in the skies, and convoys of refugees on the move. Panic buying spread from Warsaw to Tokyo. In New York and London, stock exchanges nosedived. For ordinary people, the war was no longer somewhere far away. It was real, immediate, and terrifying. But for generals and admirals, the escalation presented a different kind of fear: the risk of a multi-front conflict. A war that could not be contained. A war that could stretch NATO, the US, and their allies to the breaking point. In the Pentagon, analysts sketched nightmare scenarios. Russia pressing in Europe. China seizing Taiwan. Iran threatening Israel and the Gulf. North Korea destabilizing Asia. Each one alone was a crisis. Together, they spelled a single word: Armageddon. At this point, I want to ask you, do you think all of these crises are connected, part of a coordinated strategy? Or are they simply opportunistic powers striking while the world is distracted? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your theories. By the third day, the world stood on the edge. NATO's forward defenses were still burning. The Pacific was boiling with tension, and the Middle East looked ready to explode. It was no longer about if the conflict would spread, but how fast it would accelerate. And somewhere, in the quiet of a secure bunker, one line was whispered again and again: one mistake, one miscalculation. That's all it will take to start World War III. By the fourth night of the crisis, the planet was holding its breath. Every capital city, Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Brussels, Tehran, Pyongyang, was locked in emergency meetings that stretched until dawn. Every intelligence satellite, every drone, every listening post was straining for answers to the same question. What happens next? In Brussels, NATO's highest council faced the decision it had dreaded for decades. The generals had made their case. The alliance could not absorb another strike without retaliating. A counterstrike was inevitable. Not tomorrow, not next week, but now. Yet the diplomats warned of the unthinkable. Once NATO launched a strike, Russia would answer. And if Russia answered, the line between conventional and nuclear war could vanish in hours. One ambassador, his voice shaking, put it plainly: "We are one bad decision away from ending civilization." Back in Washington, the president had already raised the alert. B-52 bombers circled in the skies, armed and waiting. In stealth hangars, the B-21 Raiders stood ready, their engines humming quietly, like predators in the dark. Beneath the oceans, America's ballistic missile submarines, the boomers, received sealed orders. If the line was crossed, they would unleash firepower that could erase entire nations. And yet, despite all the power, there was paralysis. Every option carried catastrophe. Strike too hard, and the world burns. Strike too soft, and NATO collapses. In Moscow, the Kremlin staged its own theater of power. State television showed President Putin in a command bunker, surrounded by generals, maps glowing with red and blue markers. Behind him, screens displayed mobile missile launchers rumbling across frozen fields and fleets of Tu-160 bombers taxiing for takeoff. The message was unmistakable. Russia was not backing down. Any NATO retaliation would be met with overwhelming force. While Europe and Russia stared each other down, the Pacific roared closer to war. Chinese destroyers shadowed the U.S. carrier groups in the South China Sea, their missile tubes armed and visible. Taiwanese jets skirmished with Chinese fighters in tense, dangerous encounters that could erupt into full-scale battles with a single trigger pull. In the Middle East, Iranian hypersonics remained on high alert, their warheads pointed toward U.S. bases and Israeli cities. And in North Korea, missile batteries were reloaded, ready for another round of launches. The world was spinning faster into chaos. On the fifth day, a single incident almost lit the fuse. A Russian fighter jet buzzed dangerously close to a U.S. surveillance aircraft over the Black Sea. For 2 minutes, they flew wingtip to wingtip, one mistake away from a collision that could have brought down both planes. Only at the last second did the Russian jet peel away. The world exhaled, but just barely. Later that night, NATO intelligence confirmed what many had feared. Russia was moving tactical nuclear warheads into forward positions. Mobile launchers, photographed by drones, were headed toward Kaliningrad and Belarus. It was the clearest sign yet that the red line was close, very close. If you were sitting in that war council room, what would you do? Strike back to show strength, or hold back to prevent nuclear war? Let me know in the comments. This is the choice on which history could turn. The United Nations met in emergency session, but the speeches were drowned out by the sound of jets scrambling and artillery moving into firing positions. Streets around the world filled with protests, candlelight vigils, and calls for peace. But the machinery of war did not stop. In bunkers, generals finalized target lists. In silos, crews awaited launch codes. In homes, millions of people checked their phones obsessively, dreading the notification that would mean the end. And then came the silence. The kind of silence that only exists before history changes forever. One decision, one missile, one mistake. That was all it would take to turn this cold, tense standoff into the opening battle of World War III. The world had stood on the edge before. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the Cold War standoffs in Berlin, during countless moments when a single spark could have lit a global inferno. But this time felt different. The weapons were faster, the alliances were sharper, the technology was colder, more precise, and more merciless. In an age of hypersonics, drone swarms, and cyber warfare, the margin for error had shrunk to seconds. In the war councils of NATO, Russia, China, and beyond, the decisions made in those tense days would echo for generations. The question was no longer if war could break out, but when someone would make the mistake no one could take back. Billions of people went to bed that night, unsure if they would wake to another dawn. And in the silence of radar screens and submarine control rooms, soldiers and sailors braced for orders they prayed would never come. One thing was certain: history was being written in real time, and the next chapter was balanced on the edge of a knife. What do you believe will happen next? Will leaders step back from the brink and find a path to peace? Or are we already locked into the opening act of a third world war? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. And if you found this story gripping, make sure to subscribe. We release daily breakdowns of global military events, hidden histories, and future war scenarios. Together, we'll keep watching the world's most dangerous flashpoints, because the next headline might change everything. Stay safe, stay alert, and I'll see you in the next video.